Hello everyone, welcome to SYNTHFOX channel. I'm Aubrys and today I will be presenting you my new module called DIGENERATOR. The name is a portmanteau of digital and generator, and indeed the brain of the module is a microcontroller on an Arduino Nano compatible board that can run various firmware. However, the module is hybrid, digital and analog, and what makes it tick is an analog volt per octave VCO, the frequency of which can be set with this knob. The calibrated 1 volt per octave CV input is this jack. The one to the right of it is an arbitrary CV input. It has a dedicated attenuator knob. The switch to the right of the jack determines if it's DC coupled exponential CV or linear AC coupled FM. What the rest of the module's controls do depends vastly on the firmware that's loaded. The character knob and its associated CV input with the attenuator sets some firmware-specific parameters, like the FX level or the selection of the sample, or at least in one firmware it has been used as an audio input. The DIGENERATOR features two options, Opt-A and Opt-B. Both have manual switch and an external input jack. Both the opt inputs and the gate inputs below them have comparators, so although they expect gates, they are LFO, sound and noise friendly. The switch and the jack are being XORed together instead of just added. That means that a gate on the jack will effectively invert the selection made with the switch. The LED on top of them shows the result. The module has 4 gate inputs for triggering different events inside the firmware. These are gate inputs 1, 2, 3, and 4. Depending on the running firmware, they may trigger a sample, hard sync the wave shape to an external source, mutate the current wavetable, and so on. The DIGENERATOR has two outputs, the gate output and the DAC output. The gate output is a binary or logic output, indicated by the LED. It outputs a gate capable of clocking, triggering, and gating other modules. The DAC output is the output of a digital to analog converter. Behind it is a true 8-bit R2R digital to analog converter, similar to those found in early personal computing era DIY sound cards. It's the module's main sound output. For the rest of the video, I'm going to demonstrate the 5 main firmwares that are available on the release day of the DIGENERATOR. Each firmware has a dedicated customizer page on the SYNTHFOX website where you can select parameters and customize it. A link on the video on customizing and uploading DIGENERATOR firmware is in the video description. The first firmware I'm going to overview is called Grid VCO. This firmware is loaded into all the new DIGENERATOR modules. I'm going to use this LVL as a sound mixer for the output, and I'm going to plug the DAC output of the DIGENERATOR to one of its inputs. No sound just yet, because in case of the Grid VCO, Opt-A is allow oscillator, so we have to flick the switch up. The frequency knob and its associated controls will function like you would expect them on a usual VCO with this firmware. And the character knob sets the waveform and the effect parameter. Option B selects between two effects available. Right now, no effect is loaded into the lower position for demonstration purposes, although in the default configuration there is an effect out there. However, if we flick the switch up, it's easy to play Grid VCO right out of the box. I have an Arturia key step right there, and I will take its volt per octave pitch CV and patch it to the DIGENERATOR's volt per octave input, take the gate output and put it to Opt-A external input. This will enable the oscillator sound on each key press. Finally, I take the modulation strip output and patch it to the character CV input. The DIGENERATOR's VCO has solid volt per octave tracking. Although if you want to recalibrate it, there is a dedicated trim potentiometer broken out to the front panel. Playing with the modulation strip allows for gritty on-the-fly expression. Although the DIGENERATOR VCO has quite an immense range of frequencies, it has upper and lower frequency limits, so try to keep these in mind when you play it. But when operating within these limits, the VCO tracks 1 volt per octave quite nicely. When the grid VCO firmware is loaded, the first gate input is a wave reset trigger. Putting another VCO's output into it will produce sounds similar but not quite like the hard sync sounds. Changing the pitch of the other VCO right now. In case of grid VCO, the gate output by default outputs a spike that could be used to do a similar thing in the other direction, as in sync another oscillator to the degenerator. Gate inputs 2, 3 and 4 also have dedicated functionality, but it's not as useful as the first one, so you can read about them on the firmware customizer page for the grid VCO if curious. Another main degenerator firmware is called String, and it is a full synthesizer voice crammed in one degenerator. It generates plucky string-like sounds, inspired but not quite based on the Karplus-Strong algorithm. This is a keyboard setup almost like before. But this time, the gate goes into gate 1 input of the degenerator, because in the string firmware, each of the gate inputs excite the string in different ways. The pitch CV of the keyboard goes to the volt per octave input, and the degenerator's character is modulated by the keyboard mod strip. I also enable the keyboard arpeggiator. In string firmware, the character setting defines both the tone and the length of the string pluck. Of course, it can be set manually as well as modulated externally via the CCV input. Opt-A selects between the two string dampening algorithms. They can be selected of the many algorithms on the firmware customizer page. In default configuration, when Opt-A is on, a more lush algorithm is enforced. However, if it's off, a more harsh algorithm is on. What exactly does each gate input do also can be configured in the firmware customizer, and by default, the first input hits the string with a sawtooth initial wave shape, the second one with a triangle. A high gate on the third gate input initializes the string with a square wave. And the fourth input sort of decimates the last initial waveform and goes with it. Triggering it many times in a row results in silence eventually, so it could be used for delay-like effects. And of course, hitting the string through the first, second or third input will restore the corresponding initial waveform. Last but not least, the gate output is used by the string firmware as a sub-oscillator. Keep in mind that the gate output is really loud, so you have to attenuate it quite a bit before putting it to the sound output. I use LVL to set its appropriate level. It's manually or externally enabled with Opt-B. I can take a clock output of one of the 2CK halves and have it periodically enable the sub-oscillator. Not only the degenerator is able to generate stuff, it also can record and reproduce stuff. The next firmware is called Micro Recorder. It records a tiny portion of audio on gate and then loops it until the next gate is received. It sounds harsh, glitchy, abrasive, and sometimes unpredictable, and I think it's very fun to play around with and use as an audio effect. A very typical patch is going on. A sine wave LFO is controlling a VCO right there. First, I take the VCO output and put it directly to the output of the system. This demonstrates the initial sound that we're working with. Now let's put the VCO output directly to the degenerator character CV input, because in this case, the character plus character CV is the audio sum. It's best to put the initial character setting to the middle and then use the CCV attenuator as a sort of a volume knob if you wish. Now let's put the degenerator DAC output to the output mixer. And nothing happens quite yet. That's because opt B enables the sound output of microrecorder and has to be set on, and also we need a gate to any of the gate inputs to trigger the recording. I'm going to be using half of the 2CK as a clock source to periodically retrigger the recording of the microrecorder. Note how each time the upper LED of the 2CK flashes, a new microrecording is getting recorded and looped by the generator. When the microrecorder is in recording phase, the frequency control defines both the length and the quality of the virtual tape that we're recording to. The lower it is, the longer is the possible recording, however, this will also make the sound more crunchy and lo-fi. And of course, when it's done recording and is looping, it will define the pitch of the loop. Option A defines the size of the recording. In lower position, like it is right now, it will be a long recording and it will try to take as much space as possible on the digital tape. If opt A is enabled, the recording is short. It will detect a number of zero crossings and then snap out of the recording phase even if the digital tape still has some space. Long recording provides more coherent looping, while short recording usually is glitchy and abrasive. The gate output goes high whenever the recording has finished and looped a few times, and low again when the recording has started. This means that it's possible to cycle the recording by patching the gate output into one of the gate inputs. How many times to loop, as well as how many zero crossings to detect in short mode, is also customizable in the firmware customizer. Each gate input triggers a different recording mode. This can be customized as well, but in the default configuration, starting the recording with gate 1 overwrites the sound data that was on the digital tape before, but starting it through gate 2 and 3 XORs and ANDs the new data with the previous data instead. Using gate 4 writes silence instead of the sound to the tape, which is useful for forced silencing or clearing the tape. And of course they can be combined. For example, I'm using 2 halves of the 2CK to trigger the overwrite and the XOR modes at different moments, using the gate output to trigger the AND mode right now, and then setting the recording length to short. Welcome to the abrasive glitch apocalypse. Another main DIGENERATOR firmware is called Aubrys Drum Kit. That's me, Aubrey. I programmed this drum kit for you. It has 4 drums. Each of the drums is triggerable through one of the gate inputs. All drums' pitch is regulated with a pitch knob. And all the parameters of all the drums are regulated at the same time with the character knob. There are 4 drums, and I will show each of them by triggering them with 1/2 of the 2CK clock here. First is the kick drum, which is a punchy, bassy sound. Its volume decay time as well as the pitch decay time and pitch envelope amount are all controlled with a character knob. Opt A enables kick drum sustain. If opt A is off, the kick drum decays right after being triggered. However, if it's on, it will keep on droning until the gate on gate 1 is gone. The second drum is the noise drum. It's started by a gate to the gate 2 input. The character knob controls its length. Also, each time a gate arrives to gate 2, the gate output of the generator changes state with some probability. This could be used to randomly trigger the other modules or even the generator's other drums like so. The third drum is the tone drum, triggered through gate 3. It's a short tonal pluck. Its wave shape and its length are defined by the character control. Last but not least is the fourth drum, the sample drum. It plays one of the 8 samples loaded along with the firmware itself. The character control selects the sample and its volume. The sample kit, as well as the gate probability on gate 2 and some other parameters unique for Aubrys Drum Kit, can be customized on the customizer page. Each other. In this patch, I'm using an LFO to clock the random value generator, and then I use its random gate outputs to randomly trigger the drums. Altering the character setting alters all the drums at once, like a macro control. Opt-B is useful for locking the selected sample in place. For instance, now I enabled Opt-B after a clap was triggered, so now the sample channel plays the same clap sample at the same volume regardless of the character control. Taking the uniformly distributed random voltage out and patching it to the character CV input. Now, all the parameters of all the drums are also modulated randomly, along with being triggered randomly. Finally, the fifth main DIGENERATOR firmware is called 20 KB Sampler. In essence, it's an expanded version of Aubrys Drum Kit Channel 4 sample drum. It also has 8 samples loaded along with the firmware, divided into 2 banks of 4 samples. The active bank can be selected with Opt-A. Then each of the 4 samples from the bank can be triggered via the corresponding gate input. The gate output turns on automatically every time a sample stops playing, so for instance, it could be used to loop the sample on itself. But for this demo, I'm going to trigger it externally using 1/2 of the 2CK. Of course, the sample kit for this firmware is also customizable on the customizer webpage, and the default one is 606 drums. There is this sound, then there is this one, and this one, and this one on the first bank, and to select to the upper bank, you flick Opt-A, and there are 4 other sounds. Changing banks can be done externally, of course. For example, I will take the other half of the 2CK to handle it. The firmware only checks Opt-A if a sample is being triggered, so changing the bank while a sample is playing will not change the sample itself. I set up a random triggering patch similar to the one you've seen a few minutes ago. The character control sets the effect parameter, and there are 2 audio effects loaded in the firmware similarly to the grid VCO. Like with the grid VCO, the effect is selected with Opt-B. In default configuration, when Opt-B is off, the effect is a simple volume control. However, the effect is harsh distortion if Opt-B is on. And of course I can take a control voltage, such as this uniform random output, and have it control the effect. Let's modulate the DIGENERATOR's timing VCO with an external source to obliterate the original sound on top of the effect. I'm going to use this sine wave VCO. I patch it to the arbitrary CV input of the VCO and set the mode to FM. Twist the knobs to taste, and there you have it. This wraps up the overview of the main firmwares and functions of the DIGENERATOR module. Although I demonstrated only the main 5 firmwares for the DIGENERATOR, there is at least a couple more experimental ones on the DIGENERATOR firmware hub page, which I will link in the description. You can also find a link to the video on DIGENERATOR firmware customization and loading out there, as well as a little tutorial on coding for the DIGENERATOR. The DIGENERATOR firmware is written in C, and there is no need in special tooling for that. Getting the official Arduino IDE is enough. You can grab an empty firmware from the DIGENERATOR firmware hub page as well. It contains a lot of useful functions, definitions, and a basic skeleton of a DIGENERATOR firmware project. We encourage you to mod the official firmware or even make your own firmware, and share your creations with us if you feel like it. And for everyone regardless of interest in programming, I hope you enjoy using this module to its fullest. Thank you for joining me today. I've been Aubrys of SYNTHFOX. See you next time.